Ela Mercer was 37 years old when she wired $500,000 to a medical account in her father-in-law's name, and she did it the way she did most things that mattered, which was carefully, with documentation at every step, and with the complete belief that the man she had married was telling her the truth. She was not, by appearance, a woman of unusual resources. She kept a modest house in the SeaTac neighborhood of Virginia Beach, drove a sensible white sedan, and wore her clothes in the plain, undemonstrative way of a woman whose attention was directed inward rather than outward. She was a senior financial analyst at a regional consulting firm, which was the professional identity she maintained for tax purposes and out of long habit, and which described only a portion of what she actually did. She bought her lunch from the same deli 3 days a week and remembered people's names and kept her opinions close. Her husband, Preston, had come to her in February of the previous year with tears she later understood had been rehearsed, and the story of his father, Franklin, whose heart condition required a procedure available only through a specialty clinic that did not accept insurance and whose life, the doctors had said, could not wait. Preston had held her hands across the kitchen table and said he did not know what to do and that they did not have that kind of money and that he was ashamed to even ask. She had told him they would find it. She had found it. She had wired it in 4 days. She saw Franklin Mercer on a Thursday afternoon in March, 13 months after the wire transfer, driving a silver 2-door sports car west on Shore Drive, laughing, with one hand resting on the door, and Preston in the passenger seat wearing sunglasses, and the particular ease of a man who believed he was nowhere near anyone who could see him clearly. Franklin Mercer, whose heart required a procedure only available in a specialty clinic, who had been too ill to take her calls for most of those 13 months. What Preston did not know, what Franklin did not know, what neither of them had thought carefully enough about, was that Ela had spent 11 years before her marriage working as a forensic accountant, and that the firm she had quietly co-founded 6 years ago specialized in exactly the kind of financial deception she was looking at through her windshield. She already knew what to do. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The house on Kempsville Road was a double-wide brick colonial that Ela had bought before the marriage and spent 3 years renovating from the inside out, room by room, beginning with the kitchen because the kitchen was where a house began, and ending with the back porch because the back porch was where, in her experience, a house finally told you whether it had been built to last. She had refinished the kitchen floors herself, a dark stain she had mixed twice to get the warmth right, and she had installed the tile backsplash behind the range in a running bond pattern she had learned from a YouTube tutorial she had watched 17 times until she understood the geometry and could trust her hands to execute it. The back porch was her favorite place in the house. She had screened it in the second spring after the renovation, adding cedar posts and a standing seam metal roof in the same dark charcoal as the window trim, and she had furnished it with 2 deep chairs and a small table and a planter she had built herself from reclaimed board and had filled with lemon verbena that came back every year more aggressively than the year before, which she took as evidence that something properly rooted did not need tending so much as it needed room. Her grandfather, Lionel Merritt, had been a small business owner in the Tidewater area for 40 years, running a supply company that served the commercial fishing industry along the coast, and he had died when Ela was 29, with a reputation for exactness in financial matters that the people who had worked with him still mentioned when his name came up. He had raised her after her parents separated, and he had given her, across the years of her childhood and adolescence, the particular education of a man who had seen the inside of more than one financial arrangement that turned out to be something other than it was presented as. He told her once, sitting on the dock behind his office, that the most dangerous money was the kind that came with a story attached. Money, he said, was just numbers. Stories were where the lies lived. She had gone into forensic accounting because of him. She had spent 11 years untangling financial stories to find the numbers underneath. And she had been good at it in the way of people who find that their most useful professional instinct is also simply the way they think. She had met Preston at a conference in Norfolk, where he worked in commercial property management and was confident in a room in the easy, social way of a man who was accustomed to being liked. He had asked her what she did, and she had told him she was a financial analyst, which was accurate, and he had asked no follow-up questions, which she had taken at the time as in curiosity about professional matters, and which she would understand later as a failure to conduct the kind of due diligence that might have saved him considerable difficulty. They had married 3 years after meeting. She had not told him about the forensic practice. She had not told him about the full scope of what she held professionally because he had not asked with enough precision to require it, and because her grandfather had told her that a woman who disclosed everything before she knew what she was disclosing it to was a woman who had not yet learned what information was for. The medical paperwork had been thorough. Preston had shown her the clinic's documentation, the physician's letters, the treatment plan, the account information for the wire. She had read all of it with the careful attention she brought to every document, and it had been good work. Not perfect, there were 2 formatting inconsistencies she had noted and set aside because she had not wanted them to mean what they appeared to mean, but good enough to pass scrutiny from a woman who had just been told her father-in-law was dying and whose judgment was not, in that moment, fully in its professional register. That was the calculation they had made. They had been right about it for 13 months. The detail she had noted but not pursued was a small one. The clinic's letterhead used a Virginia State Medical Licensing Board number that she had not verified, because verifying it would have required her to believe the question needed asking, and she had not been ready to believe that yet. The silver sports car on Shore Drive corrected that. She pulled into a parking area off the road and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel and watched the silver car move away through the afternoon traffic. Franklin's arm resting on the door, in the comfortable posture of a man who had no awareness of being observed by anyone who mattered. Her face remained perfectly calm. She drove home. She went to the home office, a small room off the hallway that Preston had never spent much time in and had once described, with the comfortable inattention of a man who did not read what was on the walls, as her paperwork room. And she sat at her desk and opened her professional laptop, not the household one, and she typed the clinic's licensing number into the State Medical Board's verification portal. The number returned no result. She sat with that for exactly as long as it required, and then she opened a new secure folder and she began. She pulled the original wire transfer records, which she kept in triplicate as a professional habit that had nothing to do with suspicion and everything to do with the understanding that documentation was the only thing that held in any kind of dispute. She cross-referenced the receiving account number against the state's registered medical provider database. The account was not registered to any licensed medical facility in Virginia or in the 3 neighboring states she checked. She pulled the physician's letters. She ran the physician's name and license number. The name existed. The license number was assigned to a dermatologist in Chesapeake who, when Isla called from a number the dermatologist would not recognize and asked a single neutral question about a billing matter, confirmed in 20 seconds that he had never treated a patient named Franklin Mercer and had no association with any specialty cardiac clinic. 13 months of a story, and underneath the story, the numbers. She cross-referenced the receiving account against the property records for a condominium unit in the Gent neighborhood of Norfolk, registered 3 months after the wire transfer, buyer listed as Petra Soles. She ran Petra Soles. Petra Solis was a licensed real estate agent in Norfolk with a public professional profile that included a photograph. And in the photograph, Petra Solis was standing in front of a property listing sign, and she was smiling, and she was wearing, on the index finger of her left hand, an oval-cut ring that Ila had seen before. Specifically on the hand of a woman she had met twice at Preston's company events and had been introduced to as a colleague. 13 months. A fabricated clinic, a fabricated physician's letter, a forged licensing number, a receiving account that led, with 4 hours of careful work, directly to a real estate purchase in a woman's name who was not a stranger. Her hands did not shake. She opened a second folder. She named it with the date. She transferred everything to it, and she picked up her phone and called her business partner. "Sylvia," she said, "I need you on a case. I'm the client." Sylvia Crane had co-founded the forensic accounting practice with Yaila 6 years prior, after they had both spent years at a national firm and had concluded, separately and then together over a long dinner in Norfolk, that they were tired of building other people's practices with their expertise and preferred to build their own. Sylvia had a background in fraud investigation and a patience for financial documentation that matched Ila's own. And she had the additional quality of being a person who could receive difficult information without requiring you to manage her reaction to it while you were still processing yours. She arrived at Ila's office on Tuesday morning with her own laptop and an expression that said she had reviewed the preliminary materials Ila had sent the previous evening and understood what they were looking at. They worked for 6 hours. By afternoon, they had built a complete documentary record, the fraudulent licensing number, the unregistered receiving account, the property transaction in Petra Solis's name funded 3 months after the wire, and 2 additional transactions Sylvia found in the joint account records. $23,000 in transfers over the prior 8 months that had moved from the household account to a secondary account in Preston's name alone, in amounts small enough to avoid automatic flags, but large enough, in aggregate, to represent a pattern. The total taken was $523,000. Sylvia set down her pen and looked at the document summary she had assembled and said, "This is not a spontaneous fraud. The medical documentation was prepared. The physician's identity was researched. The account was established in advance. This was planned at minimum 4 to 6 months before he came to you with the story. He came to me in February," Ila said. "Then the planning started the previous fall." Sylvia looked at her directly. Franklin was in it. The account receiving the wire required his identity documents to open it. He is not a victim in this. Ila had understood that since Shore Drive. She needed to hear it stated plainly. She called Miriam Foster that evening. Miriam was a civil and family law attorney in Virginia Beach who had represented Ila in a property dispute 2 years prior, and who had the specific professional gift of understanding a financial situation without requiring it to be explained more than once. She reviewed the documentation summary over the phone and said she could be at Ila's office Thursday morning and would bring 2 associates. The grandmother's voice came to her that night, her mother's mother, who had sat across from her grandfather at the supply company's table for 38 years and who had said once, in Ila's hearing, that the measure of a swindle was not its complexity but its intimacy, that the closer the person, the crueler the architecture. She had not forgotten that. Real power operated in quiet rooms, but sometimes the quiet room had to be dismantled publicly. 2 days before Miriam filed the civil complaint in Virginia Beach Circuit Court, Ila drove to see her Aunt Ruth, her grandfather's youngest daughter who lived in a townhouse in Chesapeake and had the particular quality of being a woman who had navigated her own considerable difficulties in life without losing her capacity for plain speech. Ruth listened to the full account over tea, without interrupting, and when Isla finished, she was quiet for a moment. Your grandfather used to say that a man who steals from someone who keeps good records has already decided how the story ends, Ruth said. He just doesn't know it yet. I kept good records, Ila said. You always have. Ruth looked at her steadily. Go finish it. And don't make it dramatic. The documents are dramatic enough. The civil complaint was filed on a Monday morning. On Tuesday afternoon, Miriam sent formal notice to Preston's attorney of record, whom Preston had apparently retained the previous week, which told Ila that someone she suspected, Petra Solis, who was in the real estate business and had professional contacts in the legal community, had anticipated that the situation was accelerating. Preston called 3 times on Tuesday evening. She did not answer. She was on the back porch with a glass of water, watching the lemon verbena move in the evening air, thinking about her grandfather on the dock behind the supply company with his ledgers and his opinions about the difference between a story and a number. She had the numbers. That was enough. Preston and his attorney had requested a meeting rather than proceed directly to discovery, which Miriam had agreed to with a particular calm of an attorney who understood that her client's documentation would be more compelling in a room than in a filing, and who preferred to give the other side an opportunity to see it before they committed to a strategy of contest. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at Miriam's office. Preston arrived with his attorney, a man named Gregory who had a reputation for being aggressive in negotiations and who entered the conference room with the posture of a person who believed he was about to find the situation more contested than it was. Franklin Mercer was also present. Miriam had requested his attendance specifically, and Gregory had objected and then had not objected, because his client had explained to him, apparently, that Franklin's cooperation was necessary for reasons Gregory had then confirmed with his own review of the wire transfer records. Franklin sat in the chair at the far end of the conference table with the expression of a man who had spent the past week understanding that the situation he had agreed to participate in had not gone where he expected. Ila sat across from Preston. She had not seen him since the Tuesday of Shore Drive, which was now 3 weeks past, and he had in that time acquired the quality of a man who had been sleeping poorly and had made no changes to his grooming that would indicate he expected this meeting to go well. Miriam opened the presentation without ceremony. She placed the wire transfer documentation first. She placed the fraudulent licensing number verification beside it, with the state medical board's negative response printed and notarized. She placed the physician's license search result, confirming the dermatologist in Chesapeake and his complete non-involvement. She placed the receiving account documentation showing the account opened in Franklin's name 6 weeks before the medical story was introduced to Ila, and the property transaction in Petra Solis's name 3 months after the wire cleared. She placed the $23,000 in additional transfers from the household account in a final stack and pushed it to the center of the table. The civil complaint filed Monday morning covers wire fraud, financial exploitation within a domestic relationship, and conspiracy, given Mr. Franklin Mercer's documented participation in establishing the receiving account, Miriam said. The complaint has been shared with the Virginia Beach Commonwealth's Attorney's Office as required under the Financial Exploitation Statute. We anticipate contact from that office within 10 business days. Gregory leaned across and spoke to Preston in a low voice. Preston looked up. He looked at Ila. He began the sentence that Ila had expected since Shore Drive, the one that started with an acknowledgement and moved toward an appeal, and she let him begin it and did not help him finish it. Ila, I know what this looks like. It looks like what it is, she said. She kept her voice at the same register it had been all morning. Even, unhurried, The voice of a woman who had built her professional life on the ability to read a number without emotion and state it without apology. You and your father fabricated a medical emergency to remove $523,000 from our household. You used a fraudulent clinic, a borrowed physician's identity, and an account established in advance. You spent a portion of those funds on a property registered to a woman you have been involved with for a period that my partner has documented at a minimum of 14 months. She paused. I am a forensic accountant. I co-own a forensic accounting practice. That information was available to you if you had asked any precise question about my work in 9 years of our relationship. You did not ask. Franklin Mercer looked at the table. Preston looked at Ila with the expression of a man who has arrived at the particular moment of understanding that is not grief and not remorse, but simply the recognition that the position he is in cannot be recovered. Gregory placed his hand on Preston's arm. Mr. Mercer, Miriam said, turning to Gregory. We are prepared to discuss terms that reflect full restitution of the $523,000, the legal costs of these proceedings, and a structured agreement on the civil claims in lieu of allowing the criminal referral to proceed on its own timeline. That offer is available today and not guaranteed tomorrow. Ila stood. She gathered her folder, the same folder she had built in the home office 3 weeks prior, the one that had been waiting, documented, and exact since the afternoon on Shore Drive. She looked at Preston one final time. You planned this for months, she said. You came to me with a story because you believed I would respond to it the way a wife responds. You were right about that part. She picked up her bag. You were wrong about everything else. She walked out of the conference room. Miriam stayed. Isla had said everything she intended to say. 11 months had passed by the time Isla sat on the back porch of the house on Kempsville Road on a September evening with the lemon verbena in. The planter putting out its last growth of the season and the charcoal, roof above her holding the last of the day's warmth in the way of good. Materials chosen well. The civil settlement had been reached in May. Full restitution of the $523,000 plus legal costs, plus a judgment amount that reflected the full scope of the documented harm. Preston had sold the Ghent condominium, which had been registered in Petra Solis's name but purchased with identifiable marital funds, to satisfy a portion of the judgment. He had vacated the marital home in February and was renting in Norfolk. His commercial property management firm had lost 2 major accounts in the quarter following the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office inquiry, an inquiry that had concluded with a deferred prosecution agreement that required full compliance with the civil settlement terms and left the matter on the public record. Franklin Mercer had cooperated with the terms in exchange for the same deferred agreement. He had not contacted Ila. She had not expected him to and had not wished for it. Petra Solis had relocated her real estate practice to Richmond in the spring. She had not been named in the civil complaint as a defendant because the documentation showed her as a recipient rather than a planner, and Ila had not found it useful to extend the proceedings further than the evidence required. What was documented was enough. What was documented was always enough if it was documented correctly. She had heard through Miriam and through the ordinary information flow of a city this size that Preston's mother, who had been warm to Ila across the marriage and who had sent a note in January that said only, "I did not know. I am so sorry. I am furious," had not spoken to Franklin since the proceedings concluded. The social cost of that rupture was one Ila understood to be total and did not comment on. Sylvia had expanded the forensic practice in the spring, bringing on a third partner and a second office in Richmond that Ila was overseeing on a partial schedule. The work was good, and the cases were interesting in the way of work that required precise attention to the shape of things that had been deliberately obscured, which was the kind of work Ila had always found satisfying in the way that her grandfather had found satisfying the clearing of an account that had looked muddled until you understood the correct sequence of entries. Beside her on the porch was a man named Jerome, who was a retired federal investigator she had met through a professional referral 8 months ago, and who had come to a case consultation in the Kempsville Road office and had asked the right questions in the right order and then had stayed, after the consultation ended, to look at the planter she was building at the time and ask about the wood selection with the particular interest of a man who found the craft of things genuinely engaging. He was quiet in the manner of people who had spent careers listening more than they spoke and had found it a productive arrangement. He brought his own coffee and had opinions about lumber grades that she found entirely compatible with her own. The September evening settled over the back porch, and the lemon verbena moved slightly in the cooling air, and she held her glass in both hands in the way her grandfather had held his morning tea, with both palms against the warmth of it, unhurried, fully in the moment of the thing. She thought about the numbers. She always came back to the numbers. Her grandfather had been right about stories. Stories were where the lies lived. But the numbers, correctly read, correctly recorded, held in the way of structures that had been built on sound foundations, did not lie, could not lie, had never needed to. She had kept good records. She was solvent. She was clear. She was sitting on a porch she had built herself in a house that was entirely hers, and the work of her life was good, and the evening was the particular kind of quiet that belonged only to people who had not left anything undone. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.